Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Truthear Crinacle Zero. As the name implies, this is the latest tuning collaboration from Crinacle, and this time he's teamed up with a new company called Truthear to bring us this $50 dynamic driver IM. And maybe you're thinking, a $50 dynamic driver IM, there's a bunch of those out there. What sets apart the Truthear Zero? Well, a couple of things. So for starters, it's not just one dynamic driver, it is two dynamic drivers, and that's not like super uncommon. There are other double dynamic driver IMs out there. But what's pretty different here about the Zero is that not only does this have two dynamic drivers in it, it's also got a crossover in there, which basically, I mean, I don't make IMs, but I think it's just some sort of electrical something that lets them have just extra control of the tuning. And with that power, Truthears and Crinacle, they've tuned this to the Harman target, which under 50 bucks is basically unheard of. And if you're not familiar with what the Harman target is, it's basically the average human's preference frequency response. If you're not familiar with frequency responses, we're not going to get into that right now, but if you're watching this video, chances are you fall within the realm of the average listener, which means scientifically, the Truthear Zero is tuned for you. And really, I was interested to find out, is it tuned for me, and how do I like it compared to some of my favorites at around 50 bucks? So for the past 3 weeks, actually probably longer than that, I've been listening to the Truthear Zero, comparing it with some other sets, and now I'm ready to let you know what I think. So like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're watching now live, you have any questions about the Zero, anything else that we talk about, leave it in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have a little bit of a back and forth conversation. It might go a while, we'll see. And hopefully I can answer all of your burning questions. But with that out of the way, just a quick shout out to Shenzhen Audio for sending this in for review. If you want to check out the Truthear Zero, I do have a link to Shenzhen in the description down below. And with that out of the way, let's go back to the table and start talking about my review of this thing, I suppose. And we'll start like I typically do. We'll cover what comes inside the box, we'll talk about the build quality, and then we'll get into the sound, and then we'll bring in some competitors just to talk about how this thing compares directly. So what comes inside the box? For starters, here is the box itself. I have it censored because that looks underage and I'm not about that, but it's a pretty simple box, and what you get inside of it is actually pretty decent for a $50 IM. You get this carry case, which is interesting. I don't know that I'll say that I love it, but it actually seems pretty functional. I mean, it's very soft. It's not going to be super protective, but it will hold everything in place. And I've never seen anything quite like this. I don't know. I think that's actually kind of an interesting way to do it. I like this better than like the really small pouches that Moondrop includes sometimes. And then you also get a very elaborate set of ear tips. You get basically 3 sets. Well, it's small, medium, and larges for 2 different styles of silicone tips. You've got somewhat wide bore here, and a little bit narrower bore here, and they also include a set of foam tips on there, which is actually pretty generous. Typically, you'll get 1 set of tips, and that's pretty normal. Getting 2 sets of tips, that's pretty standout. And then apart from that, I mean, that's about as much as you get for the accessories. So then I'll take us to the IM itself, which we can start talking about. For starters, this cable. I'm going to punch into this, and it's probably not going to look like much of a cable. It's pretty basic IM cable, but to be honest, I actually really like it. I think this cable is a good match for this IM in a number of ways. So for starters, one, it's just thin and lightweight. I like that. You can see that the behavior on it is good. It's not especially stiff. It's not memory prone. And maybe it's not particularly plush or anything like that. Like, this is not a fancy cable. This is pretty much bare bones cable, but given how bad some cables can be, I'm actually pretty happy with the quality of this cable. It's maybe a little bit on the stretchy side. Like, there's some flex in there, which is maybe a little bit different than what I'm used to, but generally pretty happy with this cable. Otherwise, let's see, on this cable, you do have a nice, I think, small, svelte Y-split here. You have a very functional chin slider that stays in place. I like to see that. And then of course you've got your pre-formed ear hooks up top with 2-pin connectors, pretty standard 2-pin connectors. So if for any reason you don't like this cable, you can actually remove it and use any other 2-pin cable on this IM, which Certainly nice. Let's see if I can navigate that back into place. Okay, but yeah, generally pretty happy with this cable. Again, it is not a plush fancy cable, but as far as a bare bones cable goes, this one really doesn't do anything wrong. I'm very happy with it. And that will bring us into talking about the earpieces themselves, which as you can see are quite simple. In a lot of ways, I don't know, it almost feels like an unfinished design, but I don't hate it actually. I think it's actually pretty good looking, pretty simple, and pretty cleanly done. It is a very lightweight plastic. You're not gonna get that to come across here in video. And that's actually part of why I think this lightweight cable actually works really well with these earpieces, is that they are very lightweight themselves. It is all plastic all around. There is a little bit of translucency here, so you can kind of see the double dynamic drivers in there. This is not exactly a macro camera, but promise you they are slightly visible in there, but it is smoked, so it's not perfectly clean. But I don't know, generally a pretty handsome looking shell. And I think maybe even more important is how this thing fits. So a lot of dynamic drivers, you probably hear me talk about this all the time. There's like a typical dynamic driver fit that is easy to wear, comfortable, but not the most secure. I think the Zero actually kind of hits all three of those points pretty well. So let me give you the fit test as I talk about this, but you can see that ingress, egress, nice and easy. Inside my ear, it is not especially large. I would describe this as maybe medium size, maybe just slightly medium large. It is taking up some space in my ear, but I don't know, it does not feel like it's stretching things at all. And then the other aspect of the ergonomics that I like to talk about is fit security, and that's where the Zero is actually above and beyond most IMs, not only in this price range, but frankly, just it's more comfortable, or it's more stable than a lot of IMs. It's got somewhat, let's see if I can pull this other one in for presentation. It's got somewhat of a long nozzle on it, which can sometimes be aggressive with some IMs. On this one, I think it's actually a very good match, but I think that longish nozzle on it just gives it a nice secure fit in here. And you can see like it fits really quite well, like it just rests inside of my concha, and then I get that nice fit security on that long nozzle with the ear tip contact with my ear canal. And just generally, I found this to be not only a pretty comfortable IM for long-term listening sessions, it was also an IM that would stay in my ear pretty much regardless of what I was doing, right? Chewing, talking, whatever. This thing doesn't break loose, and that's what I like to see. The one thing I will call out on this thing, okay, I mentioned that it has somewhat of a long nozzle. Let me pull this ear tip off so you can take a look. It's not super long, but it's a little bit on the long side. And that's actually why I've got Moondrop spring tips on here. If you're wondering why I'm not using any of the stock tips, it's just because the spring tips shorten the length a little bit, and that helped with the fit for me. The other thing that's worth calling out a little bit here is that the nozzle is a smidge on the wide side. So depending on the size of your ear canal entrance, that could be a problem. It could create a bit of a pressure point in your ear canal, which might reduce long-term comfort. I'm only mentioning that not because it was an issue for me, but I did feel it. I could feel that it was there, and I have heard from some others that that might be a concern. So worth bringing that up here. But again, I think, look, at $50, getting this level of fit security is pretty rare, if I'm perfectly honest, and I don't know, I really don't have any complaints with the comfort on this set or the build in general. So there you go. That is my thoughts here on the build of the Truthear Zero. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in and start talking about the sound here on this IM. And like I typically do, we'll start by just describing the sound signature, and then we'll dive into talking about exactly what do I like and what do I dislike, and then we'll get into the comparisons, okay? So the general sound signature, I've already given you sort of the cheat sheet on this thing. This is tuned as Harman neutral, right? Which is really, if you're afraid of the word neutral, this is not a boring neutral tuned IM. This is tuned to the Harman target, which, if you're not familiar with that, it basically means it's an IM that has a fairly significant sub-bass emphasis, and it's also got some forwardness in like the upper mid-range vocal region, right? So tuning-wise, I would say, again, this is pretty forward in the upper mids. It's actually a little bit trebly too, in sort of the lower treble. I think that treble region is not so much an area where you're likely to get fatigue, but it is an area where it's likely to add that sense of clarity to the sound, right? So you get a nice forward sound with a lot of clarity here in this tuning. And then of course you also get the Harman style, fairly dominant low end, right? You get a lot of bass on this set, all right? And if you're looking for a bassy set and you're worried about hearing about, a bassy IM that smears into the mid-range, that's exactly what you don't need to worry about with a Harman tune, because the way that Harman target tuning is, it's basically, I don't know if I can draw a frequency response. It's like this big glob of bass, and then you get a fairly flat mid-range. And that's the Harman thing, all right? This is my drawing of the Harman thing. And that's what the crossover in this IM allowed them to tune this to do. And what that means is you get that gobs of bass, but you get it without it blooming or smearing up the mid-range or anything like that, like you might have heard about with some other bassy IMs. So yeah, it's definitely bassy, and it's definitely forward on the upper mids and lower treble. You could honestly call this, if this Harman target wasn't a thing already, or if that name didn't exist already, you could probably call this some sort of V-shaped sound signature, but you actually get really surprisingly clean mid-range out of it. So it's not totally sucked out mid-range like you would get on your more traditional V-shaped sound signature. Again, this is tuned basically to be to meet the preferences of the average listener. And if you're just getting into IMs, right, and you don't know what a lot of these words I'm using are describing, or like you know what they mean, but you don't really know what they mean in terms of your personal listening experience, this is actually a really good place to start. Because again, it's scientifically designed to appeal to most people, so most likely it will meet your preferences. But even if it doesn't, like, this is just a good sort of baseline sound signature to start from, and then from there you can start getting into, I want a warmer set, I want a brighter set, I want a more laid back set, etc., etc., etc. So that's the general tuning here on the Truthear Cross Crinacle Zero. So what do I like about the sound here on this set? Well, a lot of things, okay? Honestly, for the bass, the volume of bass that's on this set, and you know me, I'm not necessarily a bass head, but for the volume of bass that's on here, it's actually surprisingly clean. Again, for especially a $50 set, this is pretty impressive. Normally this much bass just means you've got smearing across the mid-range. It sounds kind of cloudy, boomy, boxy, whatever kind of too much bass word you can think of. And I really don't get any of that here with the Zero. It's pretty impressive, honestly, at any price, but especially here at $50. And it's not just gobs of bass, it actually has a pretty nice texture to it. I think the bass has a nice bounce to it. You get a decent amount of texture to it. The bass is, somewhat mid-bassy, and it does roll off. You can actually see this in the frequency response. It does roll off in the sub bass, but I don't really think it comes across as necessarily rolled off there. It really just seems like plenty of bass, and again, you get a decent sense of texture from it. So there's that. I mean, generally it's just a very clean sound, so not just the bass, but the mid-range and the treble and stuff. Generally very clean. Again, you get that sense of clarity, which is a thing I generally like, and I think most people do. So it's got that going for it. In terms of 3D imaging and stuff like that, I think this is not necessarily standout, but it's actually pretty decent. And again, for $50, set your expectations, but I think this actually does that sense of layering and depth and making sure that sound like they're coming from specific points. This actually does that pretty well. In fact, I would say it's better than average, especially in the treble extension, which is pretty interesting to see on a $50 IM. And that, in my opinion, just kind of contributes to not only an added sense of kind of detail up top, even though the mid-range isn't so much detailed, it does give you a nice sense of detail up top and also that sense of space to it, okay? So that's what I really like here on the sound of the Zero. But what are some of the things that maybe I don't love about it? There are some. Okay, so while the Harman target, like I just talked about, is scientifically designed to meet the average human preference, it's not my preference, right? I've talked about this before. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this much bass. So this is definitely bassier than I like. And to be honest, the bass most of the time is pretty fun, but sometimes I do find it a little bit distracting. If you are, again, just getting into IMs and you don't really know how much bass you like, and you listen to something like this, this is a lot of bass. but it's also not the most bass you can get. So there is more ridiculous sets out there, but I do find that the bass sometimes on this set is a little bit distracting. Again, it can be pretty fun, and especially good with like simple electronic music, but with maybe more organic music, that's where I find it a little bit distracting. And then that bass in the upper mid-range and lower treble lift, I think contribute to generally a very contrasty sound on this set that I think is basically a V-shaped sound signature, if I'm perfectly honest. It's, it gives you a nice clean mid-range, but it's a little bit weightless in the mid-range. Definitely not like a rich mid-range, which is typically what I prefer, okay? Do you prefer that scientifically? Provably, probably not, but that's what I prefer, okay? And then there is somewhat a sense of low detail, again, especially through that mid-range. I think a lot of it just because it comes across so kind of like thin and weightless. It's a bit of a high-level complaint to lob at a $50 IM, but there it is. And it just means that, like, things like vocals, which I like a lot of vocal content, they don't sound super textured here on the Truthear Zero. And then the last thing that I will throw in there is that it was not super bad, but I did find that the Zero could be a touch sibilant. For example, there's like, the Parcels Live album I listen to. That's usually a good test of sibilance because it's not an especially sibilant recording. Maybe that recording of me just saying especially sibilant is, but this was a set that brought it out a little bit. So there you go. That is my general thoughts here on the Truthear Zero. Talked about what I like, what I don't like, but how do we talk about this thing in context of some other IMs that I like in this price range? So with that said, let's pull this stuff out of the way and pull in some competitors to the Truthear Zero. All right. And of course I got to bring this one in. So what we've got here, of course, we've got the $50 Truthear Zero. That's the double dynamic driver IM. Here we've got, I think it's also $50. This is the Triple Win Cross HBB Mele. Also $50 single dynamic driver IM. This one came out, I think, about a year ago. Over here, we've got the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus, which is, I believe, a $60 dynamic driver IM. And then finally, here we've got the Moondrop Stardust, aka the SSR, $40 dynamic driver IM. I'll say right now, this is the one that is the most different of the bunch, and just, I don't know. We'll describe how they compare, and you make up your own mind about them, okay? In terms of general sound signature, okay, we'll just talk about them there again. The Truthear Zero, we just talked about this. Harman neutral, it's bassy, clean mid-range, bright up top. The HBB, the Triple Win HBB Mele, on the other hand, is a much meatier, bassier set. So I mentioned this is pretty bassy. This is even bassier, and it's more like in that mid-bass region where you get more sense of punch and more of a sense of thickness to the sound of it. I'd also say this one's pretty safe, especially in like the treble region. It's a little bit rolled off and a little bit soft up in the treble. So if you're worried about being treble sensitive or anything like that, that's a thing that you don't have to worry about here with the Mele. The T2 Plus, in contrast, I would say versus these is still a bassy set, a little bit bassy set, but it's more mid-rangey. Of the bunch, I would say this is the more mid-rangey, and it's also, it is still a little bit mid-bassy, but it also comes across a little bit bright in comparison to these two other ones. And then finally, I'll bring in the Moondrop SSR, which is the most different of the bunch. You could call this some version of neutral. It's the most vocal focused of the bunch. I would say it's the brightest, the most forward sounding of the bunch, and probably the least bass emphasis. It's neutral with a bit of a bright bias. Okay, so that's how they generally compare in terms of sound signature. Let's talk about them in terms of the technical aspects. Okay, so back here to the Zero. I think the bass has like the most bounce and definition on the set, and then you do, like I mentioned, get pretty decent sense of layering and separation. Not a big soundstage or anything like that, but who cares? It's a $50 IM. Don't expect soundstage, and so there. Generally pretty good on the tech stuff, to be honest. Just where this one is the most lacking is kind of in that mid-range resolution. The Triple Win Mele here, the bass in comparison, I would say, is actually a tad smeary. It does hit pretty hard. It hits harder, so you get more physicality out of the bass here on the Mele, but it also comes across a little bit more smeary. I think because of that, the mid-range, again, lacks any sense of micro contrast. And I think imaging on this thing is also pretty mediocre, largely, I would guess, because of the rolled off treble. The T2 Plus, in contrast, I would actually say of the bunch probably has the whitest stereo image. It's got the best sense of micro contrast through the mid-range, which I would attribute to some of that brightness in the treble. So I think this one has probably the best mid-range resolution of these three, but the bass on this is actually probably the softest of the bunch. It's a little bit pillowy in comparison to these three, or these two. And then finally, I'm comparing these three specifically, and then I'm going to pull in the Stardust as kind of like an alternative. Of the bunch here on the table, I think this actually by far is the most technical set here. It's got the best stereo image for my preferences, just a really surprisingly good sense of separation between sounds, positioning, etc., etc., etc. All that stuff that I really like and find exciting in a sound. I think the Stardust, aka SSR, does it best. The bass on this thing also, while it is tuned lower bass than the rest of these, I actually find to be like one of the highest quality basses. It's just like surprisingly tight and punchy, and in combination with that and the treble tuning, which is surprisingly smooth despite being overly forward, you just get really excellent sense of layering here on the SSR. Okay, now finally talk about form factor. The Truthear Zero. Let's punch in on that again. It is an all plastic build. It is in fact the only one on this table that is an all plastic build. It's lightweight. To be honest, it feels the cheapest of the bunch, but I don't think that's so much of a downside, because I think in terms of fit security, this is by far the best of the four that I have here on the table. So there you go. I don't know. You trade off that build quality feel for an IM that's actually in practice more serviceable. So there you go. The Mele, in comparison, I think it's actually pretty handsome. A little subtle dark look to it, but it's also got metal shells in here. It is somewhat shallow fit on the nozzle length, but I don't really have an issue with it. Just it fits. Fit security is pretty average for a single dynamic driver, and then the cable that it comes with is also honestly a pretty good match too. It's a nice lightweight cable, behaves well. So there you go. The T2 Plus, build quality wise, I would actually say the shells are actually quite nice. They are all metal shell. You can see it's super smooth around all sides, so no sharp edges touch the ear. But fit security, I would say, is not excellent on this thing. I do actually have a different cable on this. This is not the stock cable. The stock cable is almost identical. It just had preformed ear hooks, and I found that the preformed ear hooks actually made the fit less stable on this than wearing this without preformed ear hooks. Ergo, I switched the cable, but the stock cable is actually pretty good on this thing as well. Just the fit security is not outstanding. And then finally here, the Moondrop SSR, aka this is the Stardust variant. So if you go to buy the SSR, it won't look like this. You have to look up the Stardust. But this is the tiniest. Look at the size difference there between the Stardust and the Truthear Zero. So if you're worried about an IM being too large in your ear, that's maybe a reason to consider the Stardust or the SSR. And it's also an all metal shell. I really actually quite like the build of this set. I think it's really attractive and handsome, but again, fit security is not its strength. But it is small. So I think that's gonna do it for all my thoughts here on the Truthear's Crinacle Zero. So I have to give it a score, right? So again, just thinking about this thing again, $50, Harman tuning like to a T is a rarity, right? There are other IMs out there that you can get that have basically Harman tuning, some under $100, but they're all going to be like Bluetooth true wireless stuff because they rely on digital processing to get the frequency response that this thing delivers organically, I don't know, electronically, however they do it. They're not using digital signal processing. So pretty impressive what they've done here for the price. And, build quality, maybe it doesn't feel fancy or anything like that, but it's actually perfectly serviceable and actually a really nice IM to use. Is it my tuning preference? Not necessarily. It's a little bit more bass than I like, but I gotta be honest, there are a lot of times I was listening to this thing and I was enjoying it quite a bit. So out of 5 stars, I'm gonna go ahead and give the Truthear Zero a very, very solid 4 stars. I think if, again, you're just getting into IMs and you're not totally sure what your preference is in terms of, all the different IMs out there that you could be buying, this is probably where you should start. This would be my recommendation for most people just getting into the hobby. Get the Truthear Zero. It doesn't really do anything wrong. And then from there, you can sort of like fine tune your preference. And maybe you'll land where I have, where the Stardust, aka the SSR, is more my preference in this price range, but there's a very good chance you won't. And again, that's why I think the Truthear Zero is a very, very good place to start. So if you're interested in checking out the Truthear Zero, like I mentioned before, I do have links in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and then I'll catch you live on the next super review, unless you're here live right now, in which case don't leave, because I'm gonna stick around. We're gonna have a little conversation, hopefully answer all your questions. With that out of the way, let's go to the questions while I wrap this thing back up.